When a billionaire's only son collapsed on a dusty Kansas road, he expected nothing more than a glass of water. But what he found instead was a farmer's daughter, whose strength, kindness, and courage would not only save his life, but also teach him a lesson no amount of wealth could ever buy. Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. The late afternoon sun beat down on the dry earth of Willow Creek, turning the horizon into a wavering haze as 27-year-old Emily Harris carried buckets of water from the well to the small patch of corn she and her father were still desperately trying to keep alive. Farming wasn't just work, it was survival, especially after her mother passed and left Emily to take care of her aging father and the land that barely yielded enough to pay the bills. Life here was hard, predictable, and often unforgiving until that day when the sound of an expensive engine broke through the cicada's hum. She looked up, squinting against the light, and saw a sleek black convertible crawling along the dusty farm road, its driver clearly out of place in this weathered, struggling landscape. Before she could wonder what a car like that was doing in their part of Kansas, it sputtered, jerked, and rolled to a stop, steam curling out from beneath the hood. Then the door opened, and out stumbled a man in his late 20s, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of sharp features and smooth skin that screamed boardroom instead of farmland. He staggered 2 steps and then collapsed right there on the dirt road. Emily dropped her buckets and ran, her heart pounding as she knelt beside him. His skin was pale, sweat beading across his forehead, and she realized quickly he was dehydrated, maybe even on the edge of heat stroke. She whispered as she gently lifted his head, asking if he could hear her. His lips moved, forming a name she barely caught, Michael, before his eyes fluttered shut. She hauled him with surprising strength to the shade of a nearby tree, then sprinted back to the farmhouse for water. Minutes later, she was kneeling beside him again, carefully pressing the cool rim of a jar to his lips. He drank, greedily coughed, then blinked up at her with eyes the color of storm clouds. He rasped a question, asking where he was. Emily brushed dirt from his shirt and told him he was in the middle of nowhere, that city types weren't built for Kansas summers. Despite his weakness, he gave a small laugh, and Emily noticed the faintest spark of humor behind his exhaustion. He admitted she was not wrong. It took hours before Michael regained enough strength to stand, and when he did, he introduced himself more fully as Michael Thornton. The name struck a faint bell in Emily's mind, but it wasn't until later, after she helped him tow his car to town, that she discovered who he really was, the only son of Richard Thornton, the billionaire CEO of Thornton Global Enterprises. The discovery stunned her, but what stunned her more was that Michael didn't behave like the wealthy men she'd imagined. Instead, he kept showing up. The next day he returned, not in his broken convertible, but in a rented pickup, saying he wanted to thank her properly. That visit turned into another, and then another. He asked her about farming, about the land, about her father's health. He asked questions no one had ever bothered to ask, and he listened as though every word she spoke was more valuable than gold. Slowly, almost against her will, Emily found herself opening up too, about the years of struggle, the loneliness of being left behind while her friends escaped to bigger cities, the crushing debt that hung over the farm like a storm cloud. Michael never judged, never offered pity, just listened, sometimes even rolled up his sleeves to help with the chores. The more time they spent together, the clearer it became that the worlds between them, his of glass towers and luxury jets, hers of broken tractors and worn-out boots, were not as impossible to bridge as they both once thought. Yet beneath the growing friendship, a quiet fear grew in Emily's heart. If she was just Emily Harris, a farmer's daughter with nothing to offer, how long before reality reminded him of who he truly was? As the weeks stretched into months, Michael's presence on the Harris farm became almost as natural as the rising sun. Emily's father, cautious at first, eventually warmed to the young man who, despite his polished background, seemed determined to prove he wasn't afraid of dirt under his nails. He helped repair fences, carried feed, even learned to drive the temperamental old tractor that had broken down more times than Emily could count. But what struck Emily most wasn't the work itself. It was the way he laughed when something went wrong, the way he listened when her father rambled about old times, the way he made even the hardest days feel a little lighter. Still, the truth of who he was lingered between them, a shadow Emily couldn't quite ignore. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies spark against the twilight, Michael finally admitted what she'd feared. "Emily, my father doesn't know I've been coming here. If he did, he wouldn't approve. He thinks people only see me as an extension of his money. Maybe that's true most of the time. But you saw me when I was at my weakest. You saved me, and you've never treated me as anything other than a man, trying to find his place in the world." Emily's heart tightened. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of reality pressed heavily on her chest. "Michael, your world and mine, they're too different. You'll go back to New York, to the boardrooms and skyscrapers, and I'll still be here fighting to keep a farm that's drowning in debt. What could we possibly build on that?" For a moment he didn't answer, just reached out and took her hand, calloused now from weeks of work alongside her own. "Maybe something more honest than anything money could buy," he said softly. The test of his words came sooner than either expected. A month later, a letter arrived from the bank final notice of foreclosure. Emily felt her world crumble as she read it aloud to her father, who sat silent, defeated in his old rocking chair. For 4 generations the land had been their lifeblood, and now it was slipping away. That evening, when Michael arrived, she handed him the letter without a word. He read it, jaw tightening, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw the full weight of his privileged world pressing down. "I can fix this," he said quietly. "I can talk to my father. One phone call and the debt disappears." But Emily shook her head fiercely, tears stinging her eyes. "No, don't you see? That's exactly what I can't let happen. If you erase this because of who you are, then everything we've shared, everything I thought was real, becomes a lie. I can't be another problem you solve with money, Michael. I need to know I matter to you, not the farm, not the debt. Me." Her voice cracked, and for a moment he stood there, torn between the life he'd always known and the life he wanted to claim. Then he did something she didn't expect. He didn't argue. He simply sat down beside her father, laid the letter on the table and said, "Then let me stay and fight with you, not as a billionaire's son, as a man who loves your daughter." The weeks that followed were the hardest yet. Together they worked from dawn until long after dusk, cutting costs, selling off equipment, planting faster-growing crops, and marketing directly at the county farmers' market. Michael, who once never touched anything dirtier than a tablet screen, threw himself into the grind with a determination that stunned Emily. Slowly, miraculously, things began to shift. A late summer rain revived the cornfields. The market sales doubled, and neighbors, impressed by Michael's humility and Emily's resilience, pitched in with their own resources. By harvest season, the Harris farm wasn't thriving yet, but it was surviving, and that survival was sweeter than any miracle money could have bought. One crisp autumn morning, Emily found Michael standing at the edge of the field, staring out over the rows of golden stalks. "Any regrets?" she teased, echoing his own words from weeks before. He turned, eyes soft, and shook his head. "Only that it took me this long to find out what matters." He pulled a small box from his pocket, not the velvet kind from a jeweler, but one he'd carved himself out of walnut wood from the farm's old shed. Inside was a simple silver ring. "I don't want to take you away from this life, Emily," he said, his voice steady. I want to be part of it if you'll let me." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, the weight of all her fears seemed to lift. Months later, when Michael finally introduced Emily to his father, the billionaire stared at the farmer's daughter with disbelief. But when he saw the quiet strength in her eyes and the unshakable peace in his son's face, even Richard Thornton understood something money couldn't teach. True wealth isn't measured in fortunes or boardrooms, but in the kind of love that takes root in the hardest soil and still manages to bloom. Sometimes the greatest riches are found not in what we inherit, but in what we choose to build together with humility, hard work, and love strong enough to bridge even the widest divides. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more powerful stories that remind us of the true meaning of love, family, and hope.